I lived in a house that looked perfect from the outside. Clean lines, wide rooms, expensive furniture chosen carefully, not lovingly. People who visited, rare as they were, always said the same thing: "You're lucky to have this place." But luck was never what I felt when I turned the key every night and stepped inside. The silence always arrived before I did. I was 27, successful by most standards. I worked in real estate, buying, selling, closing deals that made other people's dreams come true. I knew how to negotiate, how to smile, how to shake hands with confidence. I went to the gym every morning, kept my body in shape, followed routines that made me look like a man who had everything under control. But control is different from peace. And peace had left my life years ago. My parents died in an accident when I was still trying to figure out who I was. One moment they were there, calling, checking in, arguing about small things that suddenly felt priceless. The next moment they were gone. Just like that. No warning. No time to prepare. No final words that could carry me through the years that followed. After the funeral, the house became too big. Rooms echoed. Hallways felt longer. Nights stretched endlessly. At first, people checked on me. Friends, distant relatives, co-workers. But grief makes you quiet, and quiet people slowly become invisible. I learned how to survive alone because I had no other choice. My days followed a strict pattern. Morning, gym. Afternoon, properties, clients, contracts. Evening. A meal eaten standing in the kitchen or sitting alone at a table meant for more than one person. I never turned on the TV for noise. Silence felt honest. Painful but honest. Sometimes, late at night, I'd sit on the couch and stare at nothing, feeling the weight of everything I'd lost pressing down on my chest. I told myself I was strong, independent, that needing someone was weakness. Still, something inside me waited. I didn't know for what, or for whom. It was a quiet kind of waiting, the kind you don't talk about, because admitting it would mean admitting you're lonely. And I hated that word. Lonely. It made me feel smaller than I already felt. Success didn't fill the empty space. Money didn't warm the rooms. A good body didn't mean a full heart. Some nights, I caught myself imagining another presence in the house. Not a fantasy, just someone moving through the rooms with me. Someone whose footsteps would mix with mine. Someone who would sit across from me at dinner and ask how my day really was. I never pictured a face, just a feeling. Then, one evening, the sink started leaking. At first, it was a small drip, easy to ignore. I placed a bowl underneath and told myself I'd deal with it later. But like most things in my life, later turned into days, then weeks. The drip grew louder, more persistent. The sound echoed through the kitchen at night. Tap, 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 like a reminder that something was wrong. I realized how familiar that felt. A part of my life had been leaking for years. Quietly, constantly. I had learned to live with it instead of fixing it. Standing in my kitchen, listening to the water hit the bowl, I felt something shift inside me. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was honesty. Or maybe it was the realization that I couldn't keep pretending everything worked just because it looked fine on the surface. I opened my phone and searched for a plumber. My thumb hovered over the screen longer than necessary. Felt strange. Asking for help, even for something as simple as a sink. I almost closed the app, almost told myself I could handle it alone. But this time, I didn't. I made the call. As I set the phone down, the house was still quiet. The drip still echoed through the room. I had no idea that this small, ordinary decision, fixing a broken sink, was about to change everything. I thought I was repairing a problem. I didn't know I was about to meet the man who would finally make the house feel like home. The doorbell rang at exactly 10 in the morning. I wasn't expecting to feel nervous. It was just a plumber. Someone coming to fix a sink. Nothing more. Still, as I walked toward the door, my chest tightened in a way that didn't make sense. I opened it, and for a second I forgot how to breathe. Brian stood there with a small toolbox in one hand, dressed simply, like a man who didn't need effort to make an impression. He was tall, broad-shouldered, built like someone who trusted his body because it had never failed him. There was something solid about him. Grounded. Not aggressive, not loud, just present. "Morning," he said, his voice calm and steady. I'm Brian. You called about the sink. That voice. It didn't rush. It didn't push. It settled. Yes, yeah, I managed, stepping aside to let him in. Thanks for coming. He nodded once, polite, professional, eyes scanning the space briefly. Not in judgment, just awareness. When he stepped inside, the house felt different. Smaller somehow, or maybe fuller. As he followed me toward the kitchen, I became painfully aware of myself. The way I stood, the way my hands moved when I talked. I didn't usually feel like this around people. I dealt with clients every day. Confident men, demanding buyers, sharp negotiators. But this was different. Brian wasn't doing anything unusual. He wasn't flirting. He wasn't invading my space. Yet something about him pulled my attention completely, like my body recognized him before my mind could catch up. We exchanged small talk, weather, traffic, how long the sink had been acting up. Normal words, ordinary sentences, and still the conversation felt easy, natural, like we were picking up from somewhere instead of starting fresh. I found myself noticing details I had no reason to notice. His hands rough in a way that spoke of real work, not gym machines. The relaxed way he stood, weight balanced evenly, like he knew exactly where he belonged in any room. His eyes focused, observant, but kind. The kind of eyes that didn't look past you. He listened when I spoke. Really listened. When I mentioned working in real estate, he nodded, asked a simple question, didn't pretend to know more than he did. When I said I lived alone, there was no awkward pause. No pity. Just acceptance. I, on the other hand, felt like everything inside me was shifting. My heartbeat wasn't fast, it was heavy. Like something old had been stirred awake. A feeling I hadn't touched since before the accident. Before grief turned my world quiet and careful. Brian seemed to sense my tension. He didn't comment on it. Didn't stare. He just softened his presence. Somehow. His movements were slow, unhurried. His tone stayed even, reassuring. Mind if I take a look? He asked, gesturing toward the sink. Go ahead, I said, stepping back to give him space. Even though part of me didn't want to move at all. He set his toolbox down and knelt in front of the cabinet, rolling up his sleeves just enough to work comfortably. Watching him there, focused, capable, I felt a strange warmth spread through me. Not desire, not yet, recognition, like my life had been holding its breath without realizing it. I leaned against the counter, pretending to check my phone, pretending I wasn't watching the way his shoulders shifted as he worked, or the calm efficiency of his hands. Pretending my thoughts weren't drifting to places I hadn't allowed them to go in years. The house was quiet again, but not empty. As Brian adjusted a pipe beneath the sink, I caught myself thinking something that made me still completely. Why does this feel like I've been waiting for him? I didn't say it out loud. I barely admitted it to myself. But standing there, in my quiet kitchen, watching a stranger do something as ordinary as fixing a leak, I felt a certainty I couldn't explain. This wasn't just a plumber at my door. This was the beginning of something I never knew how to ask for, but had always hoped would find me anyway. Brian stayed focused on the sink, but my attention never left him. I told myself it was normal. Any homeowner watches a repair, right? Still, I knew I was watching more than necessary. The quiet confidence in his movements held me there. Every turn of a wrench, every measured pause before adjusting something. It all felt deliberate, steady, like he trusted the process. Unlike me. So, he said casually, breaking the silence without looking up. How long you been living here? About 5 years, I replied. Bought it not long after I started doing well in real estate. Nice place, he said. Big. Too big, I admitted before I could stop myself. Brian glanced up at that, not surprised, not curious in a way that felt intrusive. Just acknowledging. Big houses get quiet, he said. Especially if it's just one person. Something in my chest tightened. We talked as he worked. Easy, unforced conversation that drifted naturally from topic to topic. I told him about my job, about how I spent most of my time helping others find places to build their lives. He laughed softly when I joked about knowing how to sell comfort without always feeling it myself. I get that, he said. I've moved around a lot, took jobs wherever I could. You focus on surviving first. Everything else comes later. Like love? I asked, half joking, half not. He paused, just for a second, then nodded. Yeah, like that. He explained he was single, not bitter about it, not chasing anything either. Life had taught him to stay practical, work hard, keep moving, don't expect too much from the future. I don't really look for anything anymore, he said. If it happens, it happens. I wondered how someone so solid could sound so familiar. Without meaning to, I found myself sitting on one of the kitchen stools, closer than necessary. The house felt different with his voice in it, less hollow, warmer. There was a moment where the conversation slowed, like both of us were circling something we hadn't named yet. I lost my parents, I said suddenly. The words surprised me as much as they probably surprised him. I hadn't planned to say it. I rarely did. It wasn't a story I shared easily. But standing there, watching him work, something about the honesty in his presence made it feel possible. A few years back, I continued, an accident. One day they were here. The next, they weren't. Brian stopped working. Not dramatically, just enough to give me his full attention. I'm sorry, he said quietly. He didn't add anything else. No awkward follow-up. No advice. No attempt to soften the pain with words that never help. So I kept talking. I told him about the silence that followed. About learning to live alone before I was ready. About how success became a shield. Something people admired so they wouldn't look too closely at what was missing. Brian listened. His eyes stayed on mine, steady, respectful. He didn't rush me. Didn't fill the space when my voice faltered. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was explaining myself. I felt understood. When I finished, the kitchen was quiet again. But it wasn't uncomfortable. It was full of something gentle, almost sacred. You survived, Brian said finally. That counts for more than people realize. I swallowed, nodding. He went back to the sink, and I stayed where I was, feeling lighter, like I'd set something down without realizing how heavy it had been. As he tightened the last connection, the faucet hissed, then settled into a smooth, steady stream. No dripping, no echo, just water flowing the way it was supposed to. Brian straightened up, wiping his hands on a cloth. Should be good now. I watched the water run, clear and uninterrupted, and felt something shift inside me. Quiet, subtle, undeniable. The house didn't feel empty anymore. And as the sink finally worked again, I realized something else had started flowing too. Something I'd been holding back for far too long. I moved without thinking. Brian had just stepped back from the sink, and I walked closer, drawn by the quiet satisfaction of seeing something finally fixed. I didn't notice the thin sheen of water on the floor until my foot slid forward. The world tilted. For a split second, my body braced for impact, for the familiar shock of hitting the ground alone. But it never came. Strong hands caught me around the waist, steady and sure. Brian reacted without hesitation. His grip firm enough to stop my fall but careful enough not to hurt me. The sudden shift brought us closer than either of us had planned. Too close. Time slowed in a way that felt unreal. My heartbeat thundered in my ears, and I became painfully aware of every point where our bodies met. His arm against my back, my hand gripping his sleeve instinctively. The warmth of him solid, grounding. We didn't move. Brian's breathing was steady, controlled, but I felt the slight rise and fall of his chest. I looked up, intending to thank him, maybe laugh it off. Instead, I met his eyes. Something passed between us then, quiet but unmistakable. It wasn't surprise. It wasn't desire, not in the way I understood it. It was recognition, like two people realizing they were standing in the same place emotionally, even if neither had known it before. Are you okay? He asked, voice low, careful. Yes, I said, though the word felt too small for what I was experiencing. He didn't release me right away, not because he was holding on, but because he was waiting. giving me space to pull back if I wanted to. Respectful, gentle. I didn't. For years, I had learned how to retreat from moments like this, how to step away before things could hurt, how to protect myself by staying distant. But standing there, held by someone who felt so present, so real, I didn't feel the urge to escape. I felt safe, safer than I could remember ever feeling. Brian seemed to realize it at the same time. His grip softened, not loosening, just adjusting, like he was making sure I was balanced before letting go. His eyes searched my face, not with hunger, but with concern, with curiosity. He hesitated. I could see it in the way his jaw tightened slightly, the way he seemed to consider the moment carefully. He wasn't rushing it. He wasn't assuming anything. He was waiting for permission that hadn't been spoken. The silence stretched. I became aware of how close we were, how easily I could feel his breath, how the space between us had disappeared without either of us crossing it deliberately. And still, it didn't feel wrong. Felt inevitable. Slowly, carefully, I relaxed against him just enough to let him know I wasn't uncomfortable, that I wasn't afraid. Brian exhaled quietly, as if he'd been holding his breath too. Then, just as gently as he'd caught me, he helped me back onto my feet. His hands lingered a moment longer than necessary, not possessive, not demanding, just present. "Floor's slippery," he said, a faint smile touching his lips, trying to make it sound normal. "Yeah," I replied. "I should have been more careful." We stood there for a second after he stepped back, neither of us quite ready to return to the distance we'd had before. The air between us felt charged, but not heavy, comfortable, alive. I realized something then, standing in my kitchen, heart still racing. Not from the fall, but from what had almost happened. This wasn't attraction in the way I'd always understood it. This wasn't about bodies or impulse or curiosity. This was connection, the kind that doesn't announce itself loudly, the kind that shows up in a quiet moment and asks you, gently, if you're ready to stop being alone. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel the need to say no. Neither of us spoke right away after Brian stepped back. The kitchen felt smaller somehow, the silence heavier than before, but not uncomfortable. It was the kind of quiet that follows truth, when something has been revealed without words and both people are deciding whether to honor it. "Do you want to sit for a minute?" I asked finally, gesturing toward the small table near the window. Brian hesitated just briefly, not out of discomfort but consideration. Then he nodded. "Yeah, sure." We sat across from each other, not touching, but close enough that I could feel his presence like warmth. Sunlight filtered through the glass, landing between us, dust floating in the air. The house felt alive in a way it never had before, like it was listening. "I don't usually let things happen like that," I said, breaking the silence. "I mean, slipping aside." Brian smiled softly. "Neither do I." That made me laugh quietly, surprised by how easy it felt. "Funny how timing works. Or fate," he said, not teasing, not dramatic, just honest. I looked at him then, really looked. "Do you believe in that?" He considered the question. "I believe people show up when they're meant to," he said. "Even if we don't understand why right away." I felt something loosen inside my chest. Loneliness has a way of convincing you that you're late to life, that whatever was supposed to happen already passed you by. Sitting there with Brian, that belief didn't feel so solid anymore. "I've been alone a long time," I admitted. "Not just living alone. I mean, inside." Brian nodded, his eyes never leaving mine. "I can tell. I don't know why," I continued, my voice quieter now, "but you feel familiar, and that scares me." He didn't rush to respond. He let the words settle. "I didn't expect to feel anything today," he said finally. "I came to fix a sink. That was it." A small pause. "But yeah, I feel something too. Unexpected, unplanned, undeniable." The honesty in his voice made my throat tighten. This wasn't a game. This wasn't flirting for distraction. This was two people standing at the edge of something fragile and real. We sat there, letting the moment breathe. No pressure, No urgency, just awareness. Brian reached out slowly, not toward me, but toward the space between us, resting his hand on the table. It wasn't an invitation. It was an offering. I placed my hand beside his. Our fingers didn't touch at first. Then they did barely. That was all it took. Brian leaned in slightly, giving me time to pull away if I wanted to. I didn't. I felt my heart pounding, fear and excitement colliding inside me. I hadn't felt this alive in years. When our lips met, it was gentle, careful, like we were both aware of how much weight the moment carried. There was no rush, no urgency. Just a quiet connection unfolding exactly as it needed to. I felt overwhelmed, terrified, awake. When we pulled back, my forehead rested lightly against his. I closed my eyes, breathing him in. Not his scent, but his presence. "I don't know where this goes," I whispered. Brian didn't answer with promises. He didn't try to define the future. Instead, he stayed. He stayed close. He stayed calm. He stayed exactly where he was, as if to say this moment is enough. And sitting there, in my once empty house, with my heart finally open and shaking in my chest, one clear thought rose above the noise. This is what love is supposed to feel like. Brian didn't leave right away that first day. He packed up his tools, finished the paperwork, thanked me for the coffee I hadn't realized I'd offered, and then hesitated at the door. Not awkwardly, just enough to let the moment speak for itself. "I'm usually working around this area," he said. "If the sink acts up again, you know where to find me." I smiled, understanding the invitation hidden in his words. "I will." He came back 2 days later, then again the following week. Sometimes with an excuse, a loose handle, a strange sound in the pipes. Sometimes with none at all. Somehow it felt natural. We started sharing meals. Nothing fancy. Simple food eaten at the kitchen table that had finally found its purpose. There was laughter, quiet at first, then freer. The kind that sneaks up on you when you've forgotten what it feels like to be comfortable with someone. Brian had a way of filling space without overpowering it. He didn't talk just to be heard. He listened. He noticed when I withdrew and didn't demand explanations. At night, when he stayed over, sleep came easily. That surprised me the most. For years, my nights had been restless. Thoughts looping endlessly. Memories creeping in when the lights went out. But with Brian nearby, sometimes on the couch, sometimes in the room next to mine, the house felt grounded, safe, like it was being held together by something more than walls. We talked about everything. His childhood, moving from place to place, learning to rely on himself early. My parents. Stories I hadn't shared in years, memories that hurt less when spoken aloud. Our dreams. His simple, steady hopes. My complicated ones shaped by loss and ambition. Brian was strong in a way that wasn't loud. He carried himself like someone who had learned patience through hardship. Where I felt deeply and often got lost in emotion, he stayed anchored, balanced. But love, even gentle love, has a way of waking old fears. I caught myself watching him too closely when he left, listening too carefully to the sound of his car pulling away. The familiar dread crept in, the fear that anything good could disappear without warning. I didn't say it. I didn't want to burden him with my past. But grief leaves fingerprints on the present, and mine were everywhere. Brian noticed. One night, as we sat quietly after dinner, he reached for my hand. "You go somewhere sometimes," he said softly, "like you're bracing for something." I looked away. "I don't want to lose you," I admitted. "Not like I lost them." He didn't pull his hand back. He didn't dismiss the fear. Instead, he squeezed my fingers gently. "I can't promise nothing ever hurts," he said. "But I can promise this. I didn't walk into your life by accident." I met his eyes, the weight of his words settling in my chest. And for the first time in years, the night didn't feel empty at all. Love crept in quietly at first, then all at once. Days blurred together, marked by Brian's presence. His boots by the door, his laughter in the kitchen, the steady calm he brought with him wherever he went. What we shared grew fast, almost without permission, like something that had been waiting too long to begin. And somewhere along the way, I stopped noticing where I ended and where he began. I didn't see it happening at first. I just knew that my days felt incomplete when he wasn't around. That I checked my phone more often than I used to. That silence felt heavier again whenever he left. Brian didn't encourage it. He didn't feed the need or make promises he couldn't keep. But he didn't pull away either. He stayed present, steady, even as something in me leaned too hard. Scared him. Not enough to leave, but enough to worry. The fear in me showed up in small ways. I asked questions that sounded casual but weren't. Who were you working with today? How late will you be? I smiled when I asked, but underneath, there was tension. A need for reassurance I didn't want to admit. One evening, he mentioned a job that had taken longer than expected. A name came up, someone I didn't recognize. My chest tightened immediately. It was nothing. I knew that. But fear doesn't listen to logic. I grew quiet, distant. Brian noticed right away. "What's going on?" he asked gently. "Nothing," I said, too quickly. The misunderstanding wasn't loud or dramatic. It didn't explode. It just settled between us. A thin layer of doubt that made the room feel colder. I told myself I was being careful. That loving deeply meant protecting what mattered. But the truth was harder to face. I was afraid. Afraid that one day I'd come home and he wouldn't be there. Afraid that love, like everything else in my life, could vanish without warning. Brian didn't push. He gave me space but not distance. And that somehow made it worse. Silence left too much room for my thoughts. Finally, he spoke. "I care about you," he said. "But I need to know you trust me." The words hit me harder than anger ever could. "I do," I insisted. "Then let me breathe," he replied, not unkindly. "Let this be something we choose, not something we cling to." It hurt to hear, but it was true. That night, after he left, I sat alone in the house and listened to the silence I thought I'd escaped. Only this time it wasn't empty. It was reflective. I realized then that love isn't about holding on tighter when fear shows up. It's about trusting someone enough to stand beside them without trying to control the outcome. I wasn't losing him. I was learning how to love him properly. And as that truth settled in, I understood something I'd never fully accepted before. Love doesn't require possession. It requires courage. The conversation didn't start as a fight. There was no raised voice, no slammed doors, just a quiet tension that had been growing between us, stretching thin the comfort we'd built together. Brian came over that evening after work. He didn't kiss me when he arrived. He didn't avoid me either. He simply set his jacket down and looked at me in a way that told me this moment mattered. "We need to talk," he said. I nodded. My chest felt tight, like I already knew what this was about. We sat on opposite ends of the couch, space between us that felt heavier than distance ever had. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then I did, because I couldn't carry it anymore. "I'm scared all the time," I said quietly. "Not of you, of losing you." Brian listened, his expression serious but open. "I lost my parents suddenly," I continued. "No warning, no goodbye. Ever since then, my brain tells me that if something matters, it's going to be taken away." My voice shook, but I didn't stop. "So when you're late or when I don't know where you are," my chest tightens. "Not because I don't trust you, but because I don't trust life." Brian let out a slow breath. "I didn't know it was that deep." "I didn't either," I admitted, "until I felt like I was drowning in it." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. I should have said something sooner too. I looked up at him, surprised. "I've spent my life being strong because I had to," he said. "I worked when others rested. I moved when others settled. I didn't leave space for attachment because survival came first." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Being with you makes me want things I've never allowed myself to want. Stability, home. That's not easy for me either." The weight of his honesty settled between us. "I don't want to be your safety net," he continued gently. "I want to be your partner. There's a difference." I nodded, tears stinging my eyes. "I don't want you to fix me," I said. I just don't want to be alone while I figure myself out. Brian reached for my hand then, squeezing it firmly. That's the kind of love I can give. We sat there, breathing through the truth we'd finally laid bare. There was no winner, no apology demanded, just understanding taking shape where fear had been. Love wasn't meant to replace healing. It was meant to walk alongside it. That night didn't end with grand gestures or dramatic promises. It ended with us sitting closer than before, not because we were afraid to let go, but because we chose to stay. We didn't break. We understood each other deeper, and somehow that felt stronger than anything we'd shared so far. Things didn't change overnight. There was no sudden shift where fear disappeared or love became effortless. But something inside me settled after that conversation with Brian. I stopped reaching for him out of panic and started meeting him from a place of choice. And that made all the difference. I found my rhythm again. I focused on my work, threw myself back into real estate with clarity instead of distraction. Brian supported that not by stepping into my world, but by standing beside it. He celebrated my wins, listened to my frustrations, reminded me to rest when I forgot. In return, I learned how to support him without hovering. I showed up for his long days, his early mornings, his quiet exhaustion. Sometimes that meant a simple meal waiting for him. Sometimes it meant silence shared on the couch after work. The house changed slowly, almost without notice. Not physically, though we did move things around, make space together, but emotionally. Stopped feeling like a place I hid in. It became somewhere I returned to. Brian's presence was no longer something I feared losing. It was something I trusted. He wasn't the plumber anymore. That was just how he'd entered my life. Now he was family. The kind you choose. The kind that doesn't demand perfection, just honesty. Love softened between us, deepened into something stable. There was still passion, still closeness, but it wasn't overwhelming anymore. It didn't consume me. It strengthened me. One evening, as we stood in the kitchen, the same place we'd first met, the same sink now working perfectly, I realized something important. Brian hadn't fixed me. He hadn't healed my grief or erased my past. He hadn't replaced what I lost. He had simply walked beside me while I learned how to live again. And that, I understood then, was what real love looked like. For the longest time, I only knew how to survive. I built routines to protect myself. I filled my days with work and discipline because structure kept the memories quiet. I told myself that independence was strength, that needing no one meant I would never be disappointed again. But surviving isn't the same as living. Somewhere along the way, somewhere between quiet dinners, honest conversations, and mornings that didn't feel heavy anymore, my life shifted. Not dramatically, not all at once, just enough for me to notice. Brian didn't arrive with plans for the future. He didn't talk about forever or make promises that sounded beautiful but fragile. He simply showed up, again and again, in ways that mattered. And without realizing it, I started imagining a future that included him. Not as a safety net, not as something to cling to, just as a presence. A steady, grounding part of my life that felt right. We talked about practical things, work schedules, time, space. We respected each other's independence. There was no pressure to define everything. No need to rush ahead. For the first time, the future didn't feel like a threat. I wasn't afraid of being alone anymore because I understood something important. Love isn't about filling a void. It's about sharing what you've learned to carry. I felt proud of who I was becoming, not because I was healed, but because I was honest, open, willing, standing in my home, looking at a life that finally felt real. I knew I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was living, and whatever came next, I was ready for it. Sometimes, I stand in the kitchen and let the water run longer than necessary. Not because I forget to turn it off, but because I remember the drip that wouldn't stop, the bowl on the floor, the way I ignored it for weeks because fixing it felt less important than surviving another quiet day. Back then, the broken sink was just another inconvenience. Now, it feels like a message I didn't understand at the time. Brian came to fix a problem. That's all it was supposed to be. But he fixed more than plumbing. He fixed a loneliness I had learned to live with so well that I stopped recognizing it as pain. He didn't fill the silence, he changed it, made it softer, honest. Life didn't transform overnight. There was no sudden happiness, no dramatic moment where everything clicked into place. What changed was simpler and harder. I stopped pretending I was fine. Brian didn't rescue me. He didn't save me from my past. He didn't replace what I lost. He just stood beside me while I faced it. And somehow that was enough. Love didn't announce itself loudly. It didn't arrive with fireworks or certainty. It showed up as presence, as patience, as someone kneeling on my kitchen floor, fixing something small, while something much bigger quietly came back to life. I used to believe that love had to be obvious to be real, that if it didn't crash into your life, it wasn't meant to stay. Now I know better. Some love arrives gently, so gently you almost miss it if you're not paying attention. Looking back, I don't see an accident. I see timing, readiness, two lives intersecting when both were finally open enough to let something real happen. Some people don't enter your life to stay forever, and some enter exactly when you're ready to let them. Brian was never an accident. He was the answer to a quiet call I didn't know I was brave enough to make. If you had asked me back then what I needed, I would have said something practical. A working sink, a quiet house, a life that didn't feel so heavy. I thought I hired a plumber. I didn't know I was opening the door to destiny. Love didn't arrive loudly in my life. It didn't knock me over or demand to be noticed. It showed up calmly, almost shyly, through shared silence, honest conversations, and the presence of someone who stayed without needing a reason. For a long time, I believed love was something dramatic, something that fixed everything all at once. But what I learned is this: real love doesn't repair you like a machine. It walks with you while you learn how to live again. Brian didn't change who I was. He didn't erase my past or promise a perfect future. He simply met me where I was: broken sink, quiet house, guarded heart, and chose to stay. And maybe that's the kind of love that lasts. The kind that arrives when you finally stop pretending you don't need it. The kind that doesn't shout but whispers. The kind that feels familiar before you understand why. So I'll leave you with this. Tell me, have you ever met someone who fixed parts of you you never knew were broken? If you have, you know exactly what I mean. And if you haven't yet, maybe your door hasn't been knocked on.